Welcome to the Silicon Valley Health Institute. This is Susan Downs. We are a nonprofit organization with the goal of giving information on health and how we can move toward optimal wellness. Today, we have Steve Blake, Dr. Blake. He's a doctor of science and specializes in nutritional chemistry. He's a director of nutritional neuroscience at the Maui Memory Clinic. He's a lead advisor and author for the 2019 Macmillan Reference Gale Encyclopedia of Alternative Medicine. He just published a successful clinical study on dementia at the Hawaii Alzheimer's Disease Center. He's presented grand rounds at many hospitals, and he's taught 25 classes at the University of Hawaii and many other universities. He's the author of Beyond the Mask, Nutrients for Memory, Diabetes Breakthrough, The Key to Insulin Resistance, Medical Plants of the World Encyclopedia, which had over 6,000 pages, Medical Plants for Illnesses, that had almost 5,000 pages, Fats and Oils Demystified, the McGraw-Hill College textbook, Vitamins and Minerals Demystified, and then Stop Strokes Before They Start, Autism, A Spectrum of Improvement, also Mastering Migraines, Arthritis Relief, Parkinson's Disease, Dietary Regulation of Dopamine, Healing Medicine, No More Heart Attacks, and is the co-author of Mosby's Drug Guide for Nurses, 4th edition. As a registered professional herbalist, he wrote the Herb Doctors Database, information from 54 regions worldwide. There are 168,000 footnotes. This is also published by Mosby as Alternative Remedies. He's programmed the Diet Doctor software for analyzing and graphing dietary nutrients. You can find out more about him on his website, which is www.drsteveblake.com. So welcome, Dr. Blake.
Well, thank you all for coming. I'm excited about telling you about the new approach to diabetes. For too long, people have been looking just at sugars in the diet and thinking somehow by controlling sugars and taking drugs, they're going to get rid of diabetes. Well, it hasn't worked, has it? Most people with diabetes have it somewhat controlled, but it persists throughout life. And I've written this book, Diabetes Breakthrough, The Key to Insulin Resistance. That's under $10 on my website. And also, I recently wrote a paper, How Excess Dietary Saturated Fats Induce Insulin Resistance. And that's in the International Journal of Translational Science. I'm happy to say that's open source, so you can read it. Thank you, Susan Downs, for telling them a little bit about my work. I also more recently became the lead advisor and author for the Macmillan Reference Encyclopedia of Alternative Medicine. And I am also the research director of neuroscience nutrition, and I'm director of nutritional neuroscience here at the Maui Memory Clinic, where I am right now. We cannot reverse type 2 diabetes just by restricting sugar and fast-absorbing carbohydrates like this donut here. We also need to reduce saturated fats found in cheese, meat, or coconut oil. If we don't do that, we're not going to beat it. Another thing that is lost in the approach of most doctors and nutritionists is that we need antioxidants in order to protect the very areas that diabetes damages in the body: the eyes, the arteries, the brain, and the kidneys. Very important. So in order to work on this, there's 3 ways that we can work on diabetes. We can eat slow-releasing carbohydrates like oatmeal and brown rice or beans. These are great sources of slow-releasing carbohydrates. They don't create a blood sugar spike, and so they don't raise your blood sugar. And they do it very slowly over time as we use our blood sugar. A little more gets into the bloodstream, and then we use some more, so insulin may not even be needed. The second step is to stay away from animal fat. Obtain your fats from whole nuts, seeds, nut butters, avocados, or olives. I did write a college textbook, Fats and Oils Demystified. If you'd like to know more about the individual fats and oils, the saturated fats, the omega-3s, the omega-6s, arachidonic acid, and all of those, you might want to read that book. It's available on my website, drsteveblake.com, for under $10, I'll say. We also need to eat plenty of whole plant foods to get the antioxidants to protect us from disease, diabetes complications. I got a study sent to me just today from Dr. Bill Grant, thank you, showing that people who ate 4 servings of vegetables per day lowered their risk of diabetes by over 50%. Isn't that interesting? The road to diabetes starts with excess sugars and animal fats. The animal fats increase insulin resistance, and I'm going to talk today a bit about insulin resistance. This is the key to diabetes. If you don't have insulin resistance, then even if you ate that donut in the first slide, the blood sugar would be rapidly absorbed into your cells. Yes, you might get fat, but at least you would not have high blood sugar, which can be so damaging. The liver in diabetes makes excess glucose. This is a problem. And the problem is that the liver also becomes insulin resistant, so that when your body sees high blood sugar, glucose, it sends out insulin. And the liver is supposed to see that insulin and stop making excess glucose. But in diabetes, it doesn't do that. That's why when they test fasting glucose, it's not the food you ate that's raising your blood sugar. It's your liver creating blood sugar when it shouldn't, because you've been eating too many saturated fats. And lastly, our beta cells in the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas, they make the insulin and they get killed off by free saturated fatty acids in the bloodstream. So those are some good reasons to limit your saturated fats. How much? About 6% of calories is about the top amount of saturated fats that you can tolerate, according to the American Heart Association. And I quite agree for both reducing problems with vascular dementia and also reducing problems with diabetes. Oh, what do? We eat reduced calories to burn up extra fat. Reducing calories is important in diabetes, and I'll show you one study in a little while where they just reduced calories to 600 calories per day, and they did manage to back diabetes way off. But it's hard to eat 600 calories a day. It's just not enough. Lowering saturated fat to regain your insulin sensitivity, and that gets your liver to quit making too much of this glucose. And by not eating so many saturated fatty acids, the pancreas increases the output of insulin. The beta cells are working again. This is what we want. The study here, reversing the twin cycles of type 2 diabetes, although not very recent, is excellent. What about the genetic angle? Some people are more susceptible to diabetes. For instance, American Indians, Hawaiians, some people around the world are more susceptible to diabetes. And yet in the Marshall Islands, which I have visited, they had no diabetes until junk food and saturated fat food and animal fats were introduced. These people have never eaten a cow because no cows live on the islands. But then when Spam became one of their chief sources of food, diabetes popped up. So you could think of the genetic susceptibility to diabetes as a vulnerability that need never be expressed if you're eating the right food. What is type 2 diabetes? Now, type 2 diabetes makes up about 90% of the cases of diabetes. Type 1 diabetes makes up the rest, and that starts in early childhood, and your beta cells are actually destroyed in that one. And some of my techniques can be helpful with type 1 diabetes, but this talk is about type 2 diabetes. Diabetes occurs when there's excess sugar in the bloodstream. And this is usually measured by milligrams per deciliter of glucose in the bloodstream. It's actually in the plasma. So if it's between 70 and 90 milligrams per deciliter, that would be considered excellent. If it's between 100 and 130, that would be considered pre-diabetes, and over 130 would be considered in the diabetes range. Now, if it's above about 160 milligrams per deciliter, we call that uncontrolled diabetes. Really scary. Damage is occurring, and that needs to be corrected. By the way, you can correct your blood sugar, usually within 2 weeks, according to the studies that I'll show you today. So insulin resistance can be reduced by lowering dietary saturated fats, principally animal fats, And I want you to think about how long that takes. And I'll be telling you about that with some very interesting studies in just a few moments. Insulin resistance in liver cells, as I mentioned, it results in more sugar being made in the liver. It's called gluconeogenesis. Sometimes the liver will break apart the triglycerides. And excess sat fats kill the beta cells and make insulin. Yeah, doctors and dietitians are advising more animal foods, and they advise this because animal foods don't contain sugar. Okay, if you eat a steak, it doesn't have any sugar in it. So simplistically, the doctors and dietitians who are telling you to eat more animal products because they don't have sugar is a huge mistake, because you're creating insulin resistance by eating these high saturated fat foods. Is it an epidemic? Oh boy, is it ever. 88 million Americans have prediabetes, and many of them don't know it. Many people talking today, 88 million. That's about a quarter of all Americans. It's huge. And 34 million have diabetes right now. By the time some people are diagnosed, damage to the brain, the arteries, the eyes, and the kidneys may already have happened. So one of the early signs of diabetes is polyuria. If you're having to get up and go to the bathroom several times at night, please check with your doctor and have them give you a blood test. Typically, a fasting blood test will let them know if you're getting close to prediabetes or not. So the problem with having diabetes is that the damage to the arteries, see the sugar in the arteries glycates, it's called glycation. It mates up with proteins in the arteries and damages them. Advanced glycation end products are formed, and the medical measurement of this is HbA1c, or glycated hemoglobin. So it increases the risk of heart attacks 3 times. There's damage to the eyes. It can lead to diabetic retinopathy and blindness. Damage to the kidneys. It can lead to dialysis, higher risk of dementia. And damaged circulation very commonly leads to amputations. It's really a good idea to avoid diabetes, and it's not hard, and I'll tell you exactly how. If you have diabetes, it can be reversed. Now, can it be completely reversed? Sometimes. But other times, at least you can lessen the amount of medications perhaps you need. I'll show you in studies where people who are taking insulin were able to stop, or taking metformin were able to stop because their blood sugar went down. Now, what does insulin do? When blood sugar gets too high, typically because you ate something sugary, fast releasing carbohydrates or sugar, beta cells make more insulin. Insulin moves blood sugar into cells. There are insulin receptors on cells, and the insulin floats through the bloodstream and connects with these insulin receptors. And then there's this process inside the cell to make the glucose transporter go up to the cell surface and pull that glucose into the cells. Insulin also tells the liver cells to stop making blood sugar, and we need that to happen, or our blood sugar will always be too high. And insulin increases sugar burning in the blood rather than fat burning, because the blood sugar is too high, and insulin tells the cells burn more glucose. Don't burn fat right now. We need to get this sugar taken care of. What about drugs for diabetes? How helpful are they? This was reported in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2016, and they found a central finding in this meta-analysis, and they looked at 1.4 million patient months of treatment with drugs for diabetes. And there was very limited evidence that any glucose-lowering drug prolonged life expectancy or prevented cardiovascular disease. The drugs don't keep you alive. They lower blood sugar. But how do people with diabetes typically die? From heart attacks, and the drugs don't limit that. However, reducing saturated fat to 6% or under of your calories, that relates to typically 11 or 12 grams a day maximum. This does reduce the risk of heart attacks dramatically. I have a book that I wrote, No More Heart Attacks. It's also on my website. Okay, this is a pretty picture to relax your eyes. How long does it take for saturated fats to raise blood sugar? What would you think? A couple weeks, a month, few years? Well, they served one fast food breakfast high in saturated fats, 20 grams, not unusual at all, and it raised fasting glucose 55%. From 90, which 90 milligrams per deciliter is excellent, just right, to 140, which is diabetic. They did this with one fast food breakfast. It reduced insulin sensitivity in 2 hours. How's that for quick? And that's why the clinical trials that I'll discuss later, who reduced the saturated fat and the fast relieving carbohydrates, they managed to eliminate diabetes, or at least greatly reduce its blood sugar problems in a week, 10 days, typically. That's about how long it took. Some studies went on longer and made smaller changes too. You'll see at the bottom of my slides, scientific studies in peer-reviewed journals. All of I'm saying is very carefully researched and referenced to scientific publications that are peer-reviewed. This is the journal Metabolism and the journal Diabetes that I'm quoting here. Again, how long does it take to raise 1 day of eating excess saturated fats? 42 grams is what they were eating in this study. In this clinic, we've recently did a dietary analysis for a man. He was eating 68 grams a day. Problems with dementia, very common. But 42 grams, insulin and blood glucose was ranged 17%. And whole body insulin resistance occurred in all subjects, not some. Every single person, every participant had their insulin sensitivity damaged by this excess saturated fats. Now, the insulin resistance persisted overnight, but one day on a low saturated fat diet, and the insulin resistance went away. So if you are diabetic, you now have a clue to how to control your blood sugar and your insulin resistance. Now, this is a study that I found while researching dementia, which I principally work with. 30% saturated fat breakfast versus 6% saturated fat breakfast in 100 students, these are young adults, reduced hippocampal memory. The hippocampus is the principal area of learning and memory in the brain. 16% reduction in memory, in list memory specifically, in just 4 days. It doesn't take long for saturated fats to damage your memory. Now, looking at their sugar intake, it only went up 7%, but the blood glucose went up from 77 to 118, from perfect to almost diabetic. And again, very, very quickly. This is reported in the journal PLOS One, 2017. Saturated fats. Now, this study was looking at middle-aged adults, and there isn't a big variance in the amount of saturated fat that most Americans eat. So because some ate too much saturated fat and others ate way too much saturated fat, the ones who ate just too much were able to cut the risk of diabetes in half. If they ate even less, they could cut it further. With less sat fats, insulin receptors are able to move the glucose transporter to the cell surface. And so the glucose can then get inside the cell instead of damaging the bloodstream. It goes inside the cell where it can help. Instead of causing damage to the artery, the glucose then can increase energy production. When I talk to people with diabetes, and of course, a large proportion of people I talk to have diabetes, they often mention low energy. And that's because they need blood sugar and they're not getting it. It can't get into the cell enough. The average American eats 3 times as much saturated fat as unsaturated fat, making this problem and others much worse. That's the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition study. The study looked at cheese and butter, followed 7,000 people for 6 years. Those who ate more cheese and butter doubled their risk of diabetes. American Journal of Clinical Nutrition reported this in 2017. What can I say? Why doesn't everyone already know this? The studies are out there, hundreds of them. But doctors don't tell you that cheese and butter double your risk of diabetes, do they? In fact, they usually will tell you to eat lots of cheese and butter. Why? Because they're very low in sugar. They're not that low in sugar. Another study compared saturated fats with simple sugars in the diet. And the saturated fats increased insulin resistance more than even pure sugar. One of the ways that saturated fats increase blood sugar is that ceramides are produced. as a result of saturated fats activating toll-like receptor 4. Ceramides induce skeletal muscle insulin resistance, and they're synthesized as a result of saturated fat activating the toll-like receptor 4. And that inhibits PI3K, which is phosphatidylinositol 3 kinase, very important in the connection between insulin and drinking blood sugar into the cells. Here's a graph of type 2 diabetes prevalence, and you can see that the lower amount of saturated fat or meat and cheese, the lower your risk of diabetes, type 2 diabetes here. Now you notice that even the vegans had almost a 3% risk of diabetes, but not all vegan diets are low in saturated fats. I have to say a lot of the fake cheese, the vegan ice cream, and many other vegan products, including some of the vegan burgers, are high in saturated fat, and you can actually get too much. For instance, some of the Impossible and Beyond types of things have a high amount of saturated fat. They vary. One has 9, one has 5. Now, if a burger has 5 grams of saturated fat, you still have a chance of staying under 12 for your day. If it has 9, you have less of a chance. So by all means, read your labels, even if it happens to be a vegan food, read the label and check the saturated fat. And even some foods that are non-vegan can have low saturated fat too, of course. So this is your criterion here. One way that excess dietary saturated fats increase blood sugar is by reducing the number of insulin receptors in cell membranes up to half. There are fewer insulin receptors, then blood sugar stays high, and this leads to more damage and less energy. Okay, with fewer receptors for insulin, the saturated fats make it so that there are fewer receptors. The blood sugar stays high, and there's more damage and less energy. Less insulin receptors are made. That's one of the 3 reasons why insulin receptors are fewer with saturated fats. Half as many because of the saturated fat intake. There are fewer places in the cell membrane for insulin receptors to lodge. And this is because saturated fats are straight. Did you know? And polyunsaturated fats are 3-dimensional. So when the polyunsaturated fats are put into cell phospholipids, there's a phospholipid has 2 legs, and they're each saturated fatty acids or unsaturated fatty acids. If they're both saturated, then the cell membrane becomes very tight, and there's not much room for transmembrane receptors such as the insulin receptor. Also, more insulin receptors are broken up with saturated fats. So for 3 reasons, the insulin receptors are reduced. And this is one of the many ways in which saturated fats reduce our ability to get blood sugar out of the bloodstream and into our cells. Higher dietary saturated fats interfere with the signaling between the insulin receptor and the glucose transporter 4. I'll show you a little cartoon I drew on this in a minute. The amount of blood sugar that can enter the cell is reduced. And this increases, of course, blood sugar and decreases the amount of energy you have. This is from a current Alzheimer research article that talks about suppressor of cytokine 3. Fascinating stuff. I'll mention that in a minute. So this is how it's supposed to work. Insulin there's a cell membrane, and below it is the inside of the cell, and above it is the outside of the cell, the bloodstream. So the insulin has a little arrow to the insulin receptor shown in dark blue. The insulin receptor is a transmembrane protein which goes through the cell membrane. Normally, the insulin receptor docks on the outside of the insulin receptor, and it triggers the insulin receptor substrate to lock onto the bottom. This triggers the PI3K, the phosphatidylinositol 3 kinase, to phosphorylate the protein kinase B, which then sends GLUT4, the glucose transporter, up to the cell membrane, and glucose can be taken into the cell. Unfortunately, with too much saturated fat, it's a very common condition for Americans, especially if they eat a lot of meat and cheese, which is the principal sources of saturated fat, insulin can lock onto the insulin receptor, but there's fewer receptors, typically 1/2 the receptors. So of course, you're gonna get less blood sugar out of the bloodstream. Also, the insulin receptor substrate is inhibited by saturated fats. And that's fascinating because the saturated fats trigger the toll-like receptor 4. And then that triggers the production of, well, first you have the nuclear factor kappa B, and that triggers the production of tumor necrosis factor, which triggers the suppressor of cytokine 3. And the suppressor of cytokine 3 makes it so the insulin substrate receptor cannot lock on to the insulin substrate. Okay, that's a little technical, but I wanted you to know how it works. And then that cannot tell the PI3K to signal the protein kinase B to tell the GLUT4 to go up into the membrane. GLUT4 is a vesicle, like a bubble or a blister, that then can go up to the cell membrane, but not if there's excess saturated fat. So the glucose stays in the bloodstream and does not get into the cell where it's damaging your eyes, your brain, your arteries, your kidneys. It's
One or
very,
two.
very bad idea to do this. Women were given less than half a cup of heavy whipping cream as a source of saturated fat. 25 grams of saturated fat in this half cup of whipping cream. And in the whipping cream is endotoxin. Has anyone ever heard of endotoxin or lipopolysaccharides? Have you? Very important. Lipopolysaccharides or endotoxins, they are the most inflammatory substance in the world. Okay, if a drug company is developing a drug to lower inflammation, they want to test it. What do? They give the rats lipopolysaccharides, and that increases their inflammation. Then they test the drug to see if it'll lower it again. Insulin resistance was increased in all women in the study. Okay, half a cup of heavy whipping cream, all the women had increased insulin resistance. The toll-like receptor 4, toll-like receptor 4 is resident typically on immune cells, and it's circulating looking for evidence of bacterial infection. And what it sees, the excess saturated fats, that triggers the toll-like receptor 4 to create inflammatory cytokines, especially tumor necrosis factors I mentioned. And then the suppressor of cytokine signaling 3 goes up and stops the insulin receptor substrate from binding. You can simplify all this to say that if you're eating fatty dairy products, it's going to damage your ability to take in sugar and keep that sugar in your bloodstream, and of course, greatly increase your risk of heart attacks and dementia too. Now, there's something else going on, free saturated fatty acids. What I mean by free is that commonly fatty acids are stuck onto triglycerides. That's a glycerol head with 3 fatty acids. The fatty acids can be anything, any length of saturated fat or essential fatty acids or others. These are not free. These are controlled. They're in triglycerides. When we eat triglycerides, the principal source of fat in food, they're broken up in the stomach, and in the intestine, they're reabsorbed as free fatty acid, but they're made into triglycerides again as a safe form of transport. And they're typically transported in LDL or chylomicrons if they're dietary sourced. Animal fats increase the circulating levels of free saturated fatty acids. The beta cells that produce insulin in the pancreas die off from these free fatty acids from animal fats. That's a 30 to 60% decrease in the number of beta cells. If you don't have beta cells, you can't make insulin. There are then fewer beta cells left. This is why it's easier to reverse diabetes, say, within 10 years of diagnosis than it is after that. Never impossible, but it's harder because as you go on eating these saturated fats, these animal fats, it goes on damaging your beta cells to the point where there aren't enough left to recover from diabetes. The remaining beta cells, and this is good news, are inhibited by excess saturated fat. So let's say you have 40% of your beta cells still there. They're still left. They still can make insulin, but they're inhibited by the excess saturated fat. This is one of the reasons why these studies are showing results in a week or two. They can't produce production when they're inhibited, but over 8 weeks, the beta cells can start responding again and producing insulin again. Now, another thing, did you know that blood sugar is normally stored in glycogen in muscle cells? I'm talking about excess blood sugar. If you drank a beverage that had 12 teaspoons of sugar in it, which is typical for beverages like the one shown, then you would have high blood sugar, right? And normally it's burned for energy or it's stored as glycogen in muscle cells. Glycogen is a large molecule that inside cells can store 1,000 glucose molecules for when it's needed. And this is excellent. If you're a runner and your muscle cells have stored up glycogen, then you can run for a long time and your muscle cells don't even need to source new blood sugar because it's already there. It's how it should work. If there's an excess of sugar that can't be stored or burned, then the liver cells turn this blood sugar into palmitic acid. And palmitic acid is a saturated fat. It's perhaps the worst, if you will, saturated fat, because it increases insulin resistance. So there's another way you can increase insulin resistance. And in the slide where it showed that vegans can still get, under 3% of them can get diabetes, one of the ways that can happen, people say, I don't eat saturated fat. How can I get diabetes? Too much sugar can produce in your liver palmitic acid, which can then induce diabetes. So we have to be a little careful about our sugar blasts as well, which we should be, especially for diabetic, right? What are the sources of saturated fat? Coconut oil is about the highest source of saturated fat. And coconut oil is 65% of the 3 saturated fats that increase both risk of heart attacks and diabetes would be lauric acid, myristic acid, and palmitic acid. Spam comes up high on the list. Half a can has 18 grams, but here in Hawaii, it's called the 5th food group, and people don't eat half a can, they eat a whole can, so they actually get more than coconut oil. Cheese is a very common source of saturated fats in the diet. 11 grams for just 2 little slices. Fast food cheeseburger can have 9 grams of saturated fat. And milk, yogurt, ice cream, 1 cup of those, 5 grams. Remember, 12 grams per day is the limit for most people. If you're an athlete and burning 4,000 calories, your limit would be a bit higher. And yet, if you're a sedentary woman burning only 1,500 calories, then your limit would be a little lower. So experts judge it by the percent of calories, but it's really easier to do it by how many grams, because then you can just read the package. What about low saturated fat foods? We have vegetable curry, 2 grams. Tofu, a whole cup is only 1 gram. Silk soy milk, a cup is ½ a gram. Pinto beans, 0.2 grams, and Swiss chard, close to 0, very close to 0. Vegetables, beans, fruits, nuts, they all have very little saturated fats. Even whole grains, very little saturated fat. You can eat all you want of these healthy foods, and they never will make your saturated fats too high. I think it's important to get a tip on where these things are found. And when I analyze diets, typically the high saturated fats are found in, I'll show you a chart as we go down here. Now, what about chromium? Chromium improves insulin sensitivity. Whole grains and vegetables, green vegetables are good sources, as well as nutritional yeast has some of this too. Many people don't get enough chromium in their diet. It's an essential trace mineral. It increases the levels of the glucose transporter 4, so you can drink glucose out of your bloodstream and into your cells. Chromium gets the glucose into the cells where it's needed. Journal of Nutritional Biochemistry is one of my favorites, and this article was published in 2012. Here's another one of my little cartoons. I have to give McGraw-Hill credit, although I drew the cartoon, they have the copyright because it's in my college textbook, Vitamins and Minerals Demystified. So in the first slide, we have insulin getting ready to lock onto the insulin receptor, chromium on the side, glucose on the side. Insulin then binds with its receptor and stimulates the movement of glucose into the cell, indicated by a small arrow showing glucose going into the cell. The chromium's still off to the side. Now, in the next slide, we have the chromium going into the cell. And in the fourth slide, we show the glucose now has a large arrow. More glucose is moved into the cell. Now, you can get it from whole grain products, but not white grain products. Broccoli, green beans, grape juice, isn't that amazing? And nutritional yeast. And yet, when I analyze diets, my own included, I don't always get the right amount of chromium every day. So I included in my supplement, the Brain and Body Food, which is like a multivitamin on steroids. It's a high antioxidant multivitamin, but of course it has all the trace minerals. And I designed this multivitamin myself as author of Vitamins and Minerals Demystified, knowing the good sources and the bad sources. These are the West Maui Mountains, and if you were able to look out our window here, you would see them. So you get a picture instead. Now, what about clinical trials where they took real people and they changed their diet? What happened? Fasting sugar went from 282 to 89 milligrams per deciliter in 10 months in one study. 282 is really high. It's hugely high. It's uncontrolled. It's very, very damaging. And 89, about perfect. Blood sugar, you don't want to be too high or too low. You start getting under 70 milligrams per deciliter and you can get lightheaded, even pass out. Typically, people on diabetic medications can take a bit too much, and this can cause their blood sugar to drop too low, and they can get dizzy, pass out, fall, and this is a problem with medications. So we want the blood sugar perfect, and 89 is fine. 70 to 90 is a desirable range. Keep us going. Another study, a plant diet, reduced fasting blood sugar from 164 high to 128 in 5 months. Now, 128 is just under diabetes at the high end of prediabetes, but still a big improvement, a lot less damage to the eyes and the brain and the arteries and the kidneys. A 5-month trial, they used another form of measurement called the HbA1c, or glycated hemoglobin, and it went from 8.1 to 6.8. In diagnosing diabetes, one of the best ways to find out if someone is diabetic is to look at this HbA1c. And if it is under 6, then people are generally considered not to have diabetes. It's a more long-term measure of diabetes than the current blood sugar, which fluctuates all the time, of course. In Brenda Davis and her Madro study, reduced fasting sugar from 236, very uncontrolled, to 161, still high, in 2 weeks. Some of the studies I'm listing below here, but I'm going to also tell you a little more. Dr. Neil Barnard did a study, and the glucose went from 163 to 128 in 22 weeks. Okay, the changes in diet were not quite enough to initiate a huge change, but this is still the right direction. 22 weeks isn't long in a lifetime. Another 22 weeks, if he can get it to go down another 35, that people would be normal. Their weight went down, their cholesterol went down dramatically, and the triglycerides went down. So he did a good job and improved it. He didn't reverse it completely. Now this, I mentioned the study earlier, they gave people 600 calories a day, water, vegetables, and a nutrient drink. That's it. That's all they ate in a whole day. 600 calories. Okay, normally people take in 2,000 calories, maybe between 1,500 and 2,500, but 600 is low. Their blood sugar went from 165 to 106, and the beta cells were revived and able to produce insulin again. Liver insulin sensitivity was restored, and that means that the liver's not making glucose all day and all night, damaging the arteries. This was reported in an excellent journal, Diabetologia, in 2011. Now I'm going to tell you a 10-step program adapted from Brenda Davis, who's a registered dietitian who actually ran this study in the Marshall Islands. And they did 10 things to reverse diabetes. So if you or a loved one have diabetes, I'd like you to look at these 10 steps and think about if you or the person with diabetes is at all willing to try even one of the 10 steps. All 10, and you have a good chance of improving. The Madro study on diabetes, the blood glucose I mentioned went from 236 to 161. That's a huge difference. The change was so big, 75, that most people with 161, that's typical for a diabetic, and 75 less would put you cured. But these people were so uncontrolled with such high blood sugars. Their weight went down, just like in the Neil Barnard study. Cholesterol and triglycerides went down. So there are good side effects to lowering saturated fats and doing these other changes. Now, the medication is just dramatic. There were 30 people in the study. 3 were taking insulin. 2 weeks later, 0. Didn't need it. Their blood sugar just did not require insulin anymore. 27 of the 30 were taking blood sugar lowering drugs. 2 weeks later, 5 of them still needed it. So 22 of the 30 people, well, 22 of the 27 people who were taking metformin and other blood sugar lowering drugs, they didn't need it anymore. Cholesterol drugs, 13 people were taking it, but after 2 weeks, only 1 needed it. High blood pressure drugs, we all know there are many side effects to high blood pressure drugs. 11 were taking it and only 1 needed it after 2 weeks. That's only 2 weeks. This is just a pretty picture to relax your brain and your eyes before I go on. The Wellness Project wanted to restore insulin sensitivity. So in general, saturated fats were greatly reduced, quick carbohydrates were eliminated, and protective dietary antioxidants were greatly increased. You can see this picture of people learning to make their own meals, healthy meals, instead of the junk food that is so prevalent in the Marshall Islands. I have to say, when I worked there, I went to the only grocery store and I just about cried when I saw what was available in the way of fresh produce. Almost nothing. I've never had canned asparagus before or since, but that was about the only way to get a vegetable. So step 1, minimize refined carbohydrates. If you look at the pictures here, they look delicious. They make up 90% of carbohydrates in many diets. In America, this is very common. They promote overeating. You just don't get full without any fiber. And they're turned into saturated fats, as I mentioned, principally palmitic acid in the liver, that increase insulin resistance. The refined carbohydrates that we look at would be sugary drinks, like this Turbo Chug, foods containing sugar and corn syrup. They just didn't eat them in the study, and you don't have to eat them either. White rice is a big problem in Hawaii because it's very rapidly absorbing carbohydrate. And white flour and all the products made from it are a big problem everywhere, sometimes known as junk food. The refined products, the refined white flour, look and taste good, but they've lost 78% of their fiber. Fiber, I'll mention, is one of the 10 steps. 98% of their vitamin E, which is very protective, especially to the brain. 82% of their manganese. Manganese is an essential cofactor for superoxide dismutase, along with zinc and copper. Manganese is one of the 3 cofactors, without which our antioxidant system of superoxide dismutase just does not work. There are many other things removed from white flour, making it into an empty food. There are slow grains. The green grains are nice and slow. Wild rice, brown rice, steel-cut oats or 12-grain cereal. Rolled oats and rolled barley are still slow absorbing. Not quite as slow are shredded wheat type whole grains or whole wheat flour products. Even though it's whole wheat, when it's made into flour ground up, it's absorbed too quickly. And so that's why whole wheat spaghetti, whole wheat bread is still absorbed a little too fast, but it's still on the good page, the slow page. Next, we get the fast page. Refined grain. White rice is a typical example, or white flour. Flaked whole grains like cornflakes. Did you know cornflakes are absorbed tremendously fast? Most breakfast cereals have 52% sugar. And when you're eating cornflakes, which are absorbed just about as rapidly as sugar, you're giving your kid something that is similar to a bowl full of sugar. White flour spaghetti, white bread, cake, noodles. These are avoided on this Majuro diet, and I would recommend that you avoid them too, and I do avoid them. Puffed whole grains such as puffed rice and millet and puffed wheat. These are also very rapidly absorbed. Not everyone knows this. In the health food area, people are eating rice cakes and they're puffed up rice, and people are enjoying them because they got a sugar rush, and they thought they were healthy because they didn't know they were getting a sugar rush. Sometimes all the medical trials fade in comparison to seeing and hearing someone in their own words. This nice lady, when she says, when I joined, I could not lift my hands above my head without significant pain. Now I am pain-free. My cholesterol and triglycerides have dropped to normal, and my sugars are almost normal too. I've lost weight and feel like a new person. I'm now off all medications. It is unbelievable. And this sweet lady is typical of the Marshallese people, who are some of the gentlest and kindest people I've ever met. I could tell you stories. Number 2 on the anti-diabetes diet is maximize whole plant carbohydrates. Whole plants are powerhouses of antioxidants and many things that are so healthy. Vegetables, fruit, whole grains, and beans come packaged with these antioxidants, vitamins, minerals, and of course, fiber. The lowest rates of chronic disease in the world are found in populations eating diets rich in unrefined whole carbohydrates. Now, looking at this plate, you would think, where are the carbohydrates? Well, there aren't that many. That's the whole point. The beans have a little, and the vegetables have a little, but these carbohydrates are slowly put into the bloodstream at just the rate that we use them up. So the blood sugar never goes very high, never goes very low, and it maintains the blood sugar over hours after we eat. This is perfect food. Now, number 3, we want to eat food with a low glycemic load. And please do not use the glycemic index. Glycemic index is an outdated, incorrect, and inaccurate way to measure sugar in foods. What we want is to know, if we eat this food, how much will it raise our blood sugar? Is it safe to eat because it raises it just a little, or is it dangerous to eat because it raises it a lot? Glycemic index does not tell us this, but glycemic load does. You may find your dietitian and doctor still using the outdated glycemic index, and please try and educate them. So focus on vegetables and beans that have a low glycemic load. That means that when you eat them, your blood sugar does not spike. Limit servings of white potatoes and grains. These can be a little bit too fast in entry into the bloodstream of the glucose derived from them. Select the intact grains rather than ground up or puffed or baked grains. Now, I mentioned that glycemic load is accurate. Glycemic index, however, looks only to how fast 50 grams of sugar is absorbed. Well, if you take watermelon as an example, you have to eat 5 cups of watermelon to get 50 grams of sugar. And it's nearly impossible to eat 5 cups of watermelon, at least in a short space of time. That would be this whole plate and 2 more. Glycemic load, however, takes into account how much sugar there is in a food. After all, watermelon is 98.5% water. Not much sugar in it. Watermelons have a high glycemic index. Doctors and dietitians may tell people do not eat watermelon and other fruit because of the high glycemic index, because the sugar is absorbed quickly. However, it has a low glycemic load because very little sugar is available in watermelons. So if you use a glycemic load, you get better information on what to eat and what not to eat as a diabetic or someone who doesn't want to become a diabetic. A whole cup of watermelon has only 45 calories, very, very little. Now, I made this graph up based on glycemic load, and this is very important. Mango and banana are medium in glycemic load, and you see that you're getting an amount here, unlike glycemic index, which has no amount. A cup of mangoes, a little bit high. Medium banana, a little bit high. If you're diabetic, I would not recommend the medium. However, low glycemic load foods, orange, papaya, grapes, pears, apples, sweet cherries. Isn't that fun that sweet cherries are on the good list for diabetes? Strawberries, peach, grapefruit, and plum. All of these fruits are very low in the amount of blood sugar that results in your bloodstream after eating them. Now, part of the reason is because the sugar is complexed into the fruit. And part of the reason is that if you're eating, let's say, a pear, it takes time to eat the pear, doesn't it? You have to bite it, you chew it up, you swallow it, you take another bite. It may take you 15 minutes to eat a pear. However, pear juice or any of these fruit juices, you can drink in a few seconds more than is in a whole pear if it's pear juice. And then it can enter your bloodstream very quickly. Also, the juice is no longer complexed with the fiber and the other constituents inside there. So I'm talking about whole intact fruit rather than the juice, or whole apples rather than the apple pie. Okay, the whole real thing, packaged by nature. Study in the British Medical Journal showed that blueberries, deep blue ate more blueberries, had 33% less risk of diabetes. Now, I hear doctors and dietitians all the time counseling people to avoid all fruit with diabetes. This is very, very dangerous. The reason it's dangerous is that these fruits, the reason they limit diabetes, one reason is because they are very rich in antioxidants. Blueberries, for instance, have anthocyanins. And these anthocyanins are able to go to the brain and protect it from oxidation and inflammation. The anthocyanins in blueberries and other factors are able to protect our bloodstream from inflammation and oxidation, protecting our bloodstream and especially our eyes. The retina of our eyes are very much protected by carotenoids. And the fruits have the carotenoids. So when you look at the list, you'll see that strawberries, oranges, peaches, plums, apricots, grapefruit, bananas, apples and pears, prunes, even grapes and raisins lower the risk of diabetes. So of course you have to be careful and test your food. And if you have a home test kit, a diabetic test kit, where you prick your finger and find out your blood sugar, you can see how you react to these foods and make sure they're not triggering your blood sugar too much and what your safe dosage. How many blueberries can you eat before your blood sugar might rise? It might be half a cup, it might be a cup, or it might be just a few blueberries. This is Lorac. My pilot's medical certificate was denied when I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. I'm 38 years old. I became a participant in the diabetes wellness program. I completely changed my diet. I love those words, very rare, and became a daily exercise program. Upon my last physical checkup, I was told that I'm fully recovered and my pilot's medical certificate was reapproved. My fasting sugar is below 90 milligrams per deciliter with no medications. I no longer have diabetes. I have my career and my life back. Isn't that nice? Okay, number 4 on the list of 10 things to do, high fiber diet. And not just normal high fiber, which might be 20 or 30 grams per day, but even more, 35 to 50 grams a day. I certainly get that much because I eat whole plant foods, and whole plant foods have a lot of fiber. Fiber improves blood sugar control. As I mentioned, when sugars are complex in whole foods, they are absorbed slowly. Fiber increases fullness, so you don't overeat, get too many calories. For instance, if you eat oatmeal, it's very hard to overeat oatmeal because you get full. They reduce cholesterol levels. The fiber, the soluble fiber, can absorb cholesterol and usher it out of the body so that it doesn't get reabsorbed or absorbed into the body. Cholesterol is circulated in our bodies. It's collected in the liver, and then it's released in bile. And 1,000 or 2,000 milligrams of cholesterol every day are recirculated like that. But if you eat a lot of fiber, a lot of that recirculated cholesterol is eliminated from your system, relieving your body of excess cholesterol. And of course, dietary cholesterol is also ushered out of the body by these high fiber foods. Many of the people with diabetes, in fact, many Americans have problems with digestion, such as constipation, and fiber, of course, helps with this. In this respect, it's better to increase fiber a little bit slowly and get used to it over time so that you don't feel uncomfortable. Viscous fiber is the key to control blood sugar after eating. Wheat, bran, cellulose, sawdust, these things don't help. But if you want to maximize fiber in the diet, beans are a great source. Nuts and seeds are great. Barley, oats, flaxseed. Ground up flaxseed are part of the program a little later too. Fruits, nuts, vegetables have excellent fiber. So you're looking at whole plant foods for fiber. There is no fiber found in any meat, beef, pork, chicken, fish, or dairy products. Exactly 0 fiber. Fiber is found in the cell walls of vegetables, not found in animal products. There are low fiber foods. Okay, white flour, white rice, low fiber, to be avoided on this program. And then there's 0 fiber foods. These have absolutely none. Meat, poultry, fish, dairy products and eggs, sugar, and oil all have 0 fiber. Then number 2, we don't want to look like this kitty. So we want to avoid high-fat diets because they increase oxidative damage and they also increase inflammation. They contribute to insulin resistance, as I've described, and they hinder weight loss efforts. Okay, it's a polite way to say make you fat. Total fat should only be 20 to 25% of calories. And of course, it's very important what the fats are, not just how much the fats are. Ideally, fats would be derived from walnuts and flax seeds and other healthy sources that actually contain essential fatty acids. Did you know that saturated fats are not essential fatty acids? Humans have no need to ever eat saturated fats. We make any that we need ourselves. So get your fat from whole foods like nuts, seeds, and avocados instead of from oils. Even extra virgin olive oil has lost a lot of great things like polyphenols that are squeezed out and put in the mash. It would be much better to chop up some olives and eat those instead of using olive oil on your salad. Now, I did mention saturated fat before, but it's number 6 on the list of 10 here. Keep saturated fats to less than 7% of calories. Even less than 5% is better, but it's a little bit tough because you see there's a little bit of saturated fat in any fatty food. Avocados are super healthy, but if you eat a whole avocado, you're likely to get 1 or 2 grams of saturated fat. Not a problem if you're staying under 12 grams in a day, but it adds up. And then you eat some nuts and seeds, and maybe there's another couple of grams of saturated fat. So you're up to 4. And then as the day goes on, you may have some peanut butter, and then you might knock it up to 6. So there's really no room for any non-plant-based saturated fat if you're trying to defeat diabetes, or if you don't want a heart attack, a stroke, or brain damage. That's pretty easy. Avoid animal fats and coconut fat. You're likely to keep your saturated fat pretty low. Now, these are sources from my Diet Doctor software. I analyzed saturated fat, hamburger, way too much, bologna, Spam, whole milk, cheddar cheese, the highest thing on the list, butter and eggs. All of these things add too much. The green bar at the bottom shows you how much you can have in a day. And a lot of these things, one serving gives you as much as you can handle in a whole day. So clearly does not fit into a low saturated fat diet. Now, skim milk, as you see, has very little saturated fat. Of course, it has very little of anything. It's mostly water. For people who are drinking milk and can try almond milk or soy milk or one of the other milks out there, if they find one that they like that is very low in saturated fat, then that can still have calcium and be a good substitute. And that's something that can happen. This lady, when she joined the program, she was very skeptical. You can see that in her face. But very quickly, I started to feel better. The cramps in my legs disappeared, and I no longer had to get up during the night to go to the bathroom. My sugars kept dropping and are now normal without any medication. My last lab test showed that I'm no longer diabetic. People can hardly believe what has happened to me. And I will mention the exercise program in a minute. No trans fat. Trans fats are a lot like saturated fats, but even a little bit worse. I mentioned that saturated fats are straight. So in the cell membrane phospholipids, they pack together tightly and don't leave room for transmembrane proteins such as, well, LDL receptors and also insulin receptors. The saturated fats are found in partially hydrogenated vegetable oils. If you see that on the ingredient list, I would recommend not buying the product. Trans fats are found in beef and dairy products. Did you know that beef and sheep biohydrogenate fats in their rumen, their stomach-like areas, and it becomes trans fats? The very same trans fats that are found in industrially hydrogenated oils, including vasinic acid. The trans fats change the flexibility of cell membranes, as I mentioned, and the number of insulin receptors, and they raise blood cholesterol, increasing the risk of heart attack, the #1 killer of both Americans and diabetics. And they increase inflammation, contributing to insulin resistance. Sources of trans fats: cakes, cookies, crackers, animal products, margarine. Now, in this graph, you'll see 21% of trans fats come from animal products, but it varies. In America, about 40% come from animal products, or sometimes 30. It depends on the area you're looking at. In Canada, it's a little bit more, and in Australia, it's about 50-50 trans fats from animal products and from hydrogenated fats. All of the trans fats are similarly bad. All of them are not eaten on this diet to reverse diabetes. Now, number 8 of 10, eat enough omega-3s. Omega-3 fatty acids, they improve the fluidity of cell membranes, increasing insulin sensitivity by allowing more insulin receptors. Very important. Include some plant sources of omega-3 fatty acids, such as 1 tablespoon of ground flax seeds and a handful of walnuts. This would be an excellent amount of omega-3 fatty acids. The plant version is called alpha-linolenic acid, and this is one of the 2 essential fatty acids that human needs. We only need 2 fatty acids. The other is linoleic acid, but since everyone gets too much linoleic acid, it seems like the one we need to pay attention to is the one that most people get too little of, which is the alpha-linolenic acid found in plants. At least 3 grams of these omega-3 fatty acids should be included in the daily diet. So, for instance, walnut, 1 ounce, 2.7 grams. Flax seeds, a tablespoon, 2.6 grams. Hemp seeds, a little less, 2 grams in 2 tablespoons. And leafy greens, I hear people tell me they're getting their essential fatty acids from leafy greens. Well, a whole cup is only 0.1 gram. So you would actually need to eat a 5-gallon bucket of leafy greens, which a horse can do, but a cow maybe, but not a human. Just, you can't get enough from those, sorry. Okay, well, what is it that raises the risk of diabetes 38 times? This study in diabetes care, I've read over and over again, and it refers to many other studies. It's results from the National Health and Examination Survey, and it found that fish can be the highest source of persistent organic pollutants like DDT, polychlorinated biphenyls, and many of the organochlorine pesticides like lindane or heptachlor, chloridane, any of those. Those who had more of these pollutants had 38 times the risk of diabetes. So perhaps fish are not the best thing to eat these days, maybe 100 years ago when these pollutants weren't in the fish. Now, polychlorinated biphenyls are the PCBs. The PBDEs are polybrominated diphenyl ethers. These are both, they quit making PCBs because they're so damaging and persistent, and they switched to PBDEs, which are even more damaging and more persistent. Not really a good trade-off. They should have just stopped making them. They're used in transformers and fireproofing and other things. Fish oil is the highest source by far, and fish are the highest source second. Eggs, dairy products, sadly enough, baby foods have a lot of PCBs in them. Beef, even vegetable oils have a small amount. But look, fruits, vegetables, cereals, virtually none. So eat low on the food chain there, and you're going to do a lot better for these pollutants. Now, number 9 is plant antioxidants, and this is crucially important. And this is something that's missed by modern medicine and by modern diabetes counselors, dietitians, and so on, because these are very important to protect our cells in our eyes from damage and diabetic retinopathy and blindness. They're important to protect our endothelium, the inside of our blood vessels, from damage that creates heart attacks and strokes. They're super critically important to protect our bodies. And also, diabetics tend to have a lower antioxidant status because they're burning up more antioxidants because of all the excess blood sugar. This is from the Journal of Biochemistry, Molecular Toxicology, another of my favorite journals. This study showed that you can eat diets rich in fresh fruits and vegetables, whole grains, nuts, legumes, and other plant foods, and it protects against prediabetes. Polyphenols are found in these foods. There are many polyphenols like flavonoids and anthocyanins and so on that are very anti-inflammatory and antioxidant. Phytoestrogens, such as the ones found in soy products like genistein and diastein. Sulforaphane found in kale, cabbage, and the other cruciferous vegetables. And plant sterols are antioxidants and reduce inflammation. The International Journal of Preventive Medicine did a great study on that. Inversely related to prediabetes. I mean, eat more of these, get less prediabetes. Now, I analyzed an American diet, typical American diet, and the vitamin C was very low, indicated by the blue bar being, so second from the left on the top is vitamin C. The blue bar is much lower than the very minimum amount that we need. The vitamin E, the third from the left on the top, is very, very low, about 5 milligrams. You need a minimum of 15. How much would be protective? Oh, 200 to 400. And folate was really low too. What about on a whole plant food diet? All of a sudden, the vitamin C and the vitamin E are in excess of the minimum requirements and very healthy to protect us from damage to our eyes and arteries and kidneys and brain too. By the way, I do my analysis with Diet Doctor, which I created myself. I did the programming and everything. It now has over 292,000 food choices. So you can not only find healthy things, but very unhealthy things. If you're eating a ding dong, you can find out just how worthless it is. And if you're eating something really healthy, like kale salad, you can find out just how healthy it is. The way it works is you put in everything you ate in a day with the amounts, and it tells you how much you got in the way of vitamins, minerals, fats, which carotenoids, which tocopherols, and vitamin E. And you can buy the program on my website, drsteveblake.com. You also can email me, steve@drsteveblake.com, and we can analyze your diet for you. Sometimes people have trouble with putting in all their foods. There's a lot of choices in here, which is good. So on the plant antioxidants, the recommended levels in this diet were 9 servings a day of fruits and vegetables. Very few Americans eat this much. I do. Beans, 2 servings a day. A good idea. By the way, organic soy milk would qualify as one of those beans. Hummus would qualify as one of those bean servings. So there's some highly digestible and convenient bean foods. Nuts and seeds, 1 serving each, and whole grains, 3 servings per day. This is how to maximize plant antioxidants, as shown by this gorgeous photo here. What about supplements? It's, of course, very wise to plan to get most of your antioxidants from your food. Vitamin C is a powerful antioxidant. Now, vitamin E should only be taken supplementary in the RRR alpha tocopherol form with the other tocopherols, beta, delta, and gamma. However, you will rarely see this on a vitamin label. I had to fight with the manufacturer of brain and body food. They kept telling me, we can give you the synthetic vitamin E for practically nothing, but if you add the real vitamin E, it'll double the cost of your supplement. Okay, that's why no one puts it in their supplement. It's expensive, but it's also the only real one. The synthetic vitamin E is made up of different similar molecules that don't work. Okay, only 1 out of 8 of the different molecules of alpha tocopherol that's synthetic is actually alpha tocopherol. The other 7 are not. 3 of them do nothing in the way of antioxidant action, and 4 others are almost worthless. So you do need to make sure that you're getting the right forms if you're taking a supplement. Unfortunately, most supplement manufacturers will give you the worst forms in the smallest amounts, and just to make money, but not to maximize your health. Myself, my wife, and a lot of the people that I talk to do take the brain and body food, which I do manufacture, so I make a small profit on it. And it's only available on my website. It's a bit of a bother to manufacture and distribute, but at least I can find one that I can take happily or recommend. Number 10 is to avoid the dietary contaminants. The worst ones, and there are so many. Food contaminants in meat, like pesticides, hormones, heavy metals. Heavy metals would be example, mercury and tuna fish. Polychlorinated diphenyls, DDT, and dioxins, very, very much found in fish, but also in meat and dairy products. And of course, there's so many. Fried foods that are heated to high temperatures may contain oxysterols. Oxysterols are oxidized cholesterol, and they can be very damaging to the brain. Oxysterols are very damaging to the arteries, and they account for some of the damage that occurs in diabetes to the arteries. Advanced glycation end products, abbreviated AGEs here, are mainly found in barbecued or broiled meat and in aged cheese. And these are glycation end products, very much like what is measured in glycated hemoglobin to determine diabetes severity. It's really best not to eat these at all. And byproducts of high temperature cooking, like acrylamides, which are made in carbohydrates like French fries and potato chips are examples there. Heterocyclic amines from barbecued meat, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are made when meat is cooked at high temperatures. So avoiding these is what was done on the Maduro trial. I would also recommend it. Here's some more about advanced glycation end products. They're formed in the blood when there are elevated levels of glucose. So they're a big part of the damage from diabetes. And they're formed in food when it's cooked at high temperatures or stored. For instance, there are almost no AGEs in milk, but when it's made into cheese during storage, the protein cross-links with the sugars and glycates. And so aged cheese does have advanced glycation end products. They increase oxidative stress and inflammation in the body, not just a little, but a lot. They did have an exercise program in the Maduro study, and these people are just not prone to do a lot of exercise because it's 86 degrees in the summer and it's 86 degrees in the winter. It's 86 degrees at midnight and it's 86 degrees in noon. It's just a very warm, humid place where it's hard to get moving. And exercise alone will not combat diabetes, but it's an excellent addition and I recommend it highly, and I do it myself. In 2 weeks, participants reported the following: pain disappearing in the joints, the arms, and especially the legs, especially leg cramps at night, often related to magnesium deficiencies from not eating enough green leafy vegetables. No longer needing leg massages at night to go to sleep. They had increased energy and they could walk easier. They no longer had to get up several times to go to the bathroom because they no longer had diabetes. And they're no longer constipated because they're getting a lot of good fiber. As I mentioned, the 3 people out of 30 who started on insulin 2 weeks later didn't need it. 22 of the 27 who were taking blood sugar lowering drugs didn't need it. And cholesterol drugs and high blood pressure pills, only 1 needed it at the end of the study. This man, Fred Heine, I'd suffered a stroke because of my diabetes and was in a wheelchair. I could not walk. After joining the diabetes wellness program for 6 months, I got rid of my wheelchair and am walking on my own again. I'm healthier than I've been in many years. The program has given me more than I ever thought possible. It provides the people of the Marshall Islands with the greatest hope we've ever had. In the Marshall Islands, the surgeries at the hospital were predominantly amputations due to diabetes. It's pretty scary how bad it is or was down there. Now, those who continued the program and those of you who continue this program or one like it will continue to remain having the benefits, the low blood sugar, the extra energy, the lowered risk of all these other chronic diseases like heart attacks and strokes. But if you revert to your former habits, then you revert to diabetes. In other words, this cure is dependent upon you, not upon a doctor or a medication. So you do have control. That's the good news. If you lose control, it doesn't work anymore. So I encourage you all to have good control of eating healthy foods the way it's made. My book, Diabetes Breakthrough, is available for under $10 in the ebook format on my website, drsteveblake.com. I encourage you to get it. There's a lot more in there than I can tell you here. It also has scientific endnotes to verify the information throughout it. It's not a doctor or a nurse or a dietitian who controls what you eat. You control your fork and you control your diet and your health. And I wish you luck with that. There's also my paper, which you can find just by typing in the title, Excess Dietary Saturated Fats Induce Insulin Resistance. And my website, drsteveblake.com, please visit and look at my other things. Well, I want to thank you very much and open it up to questions. Hi, Joanna C.
Hi, Steve. Great talk. Do you see any problem with using stocks and broths?
Oh boy, well, one of the problems with bone broth in particular is the lead content. It's true that a diet is not defined by what you don't eat, but by what you do eat. And for instance, if you're eating a plant-based diet and you analyze it and you look and see, wow, I'm not getting essential fatty acids, or I'm not getting enough calories, or I'm not getting any carotenoids, or I'm not getting enough of this vitamin or that mineral, then that can make you weak. Perhaps your vitamin B12 was missing. Were you supplementing during your...
And do you have an opinion on eggs, like local organic eggs?
Of course, I analyze eggs for their nutritive content, and I just can't find anything in eggs that I would ever need to eat. And of course, there's some good reasons not to eat eggs, such as the extremely high cholesterol. They're like cholesterol bombs. The eggs have so much cholesterol. Say 2 eggs has typically about 300 to 360. Actually, somebody just popped up that 80% of our cholesterol we make. No, we make 100% of our cholesterol. Do you know how many cholesterol molecules are made in the human body every second? 70 quadrillion. That's enough, okay? We need to eat no cholesterol. None is required in our diet, and any cholesterol we eat in our diet is too much. If you cook the eggs, you get oxysterols, oxidized cholesterol. The oxidized cholesterol is packaged into chylomicrons and transported through the blood vessels and enters the brain, where it damages brain cells. It's also found in the plaque in atherosclerosis and is associated with the Wirth plaque. And one of the really scary parts is that when you eat a cholesterol bomb, like a couple of eggs, the excess cholesterol turning into oxysterols can form cholesterol crystals, rupturing plaque that has sat there for decades, thus triggering the stroke or heart attack that may kill you or render you a vegetable. So for these reasons, I don't recommend eggs.
Patty, why don't you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes. Hi, Dr. Blake. I have a question. My husband was recently diagnosed with diabetes and also kidney disease. And I noticed that you mentioned a lot about legumes like beans and, brown rice and things like that. Well, the thing is that with, beans and brown rice, they're high in potassium. So someone with kidney disease can't really eat those, right?
It doesn't take a lot of beans to be satisfied. For instance, 2 tablespoons of refried beans with a meal will create a very satisfying and very protein-rich addition to a meal without contributing excess amounts of potassium. When I look at the studies on chronic kidney disease, I see what leads up to it. The risk is vastly increased, and I have study after study on this. I have 100 studies on this showing that meat eaters are the ones who get chronic kidney disease.
What about avocado? I know with avocado, the potassium is quite high. So should I eliminate avocado?
Well, I certainly wouldn't. However, we limit avocados just because you can get a little fat if you eat too many, and enough is enough. Again, avocado has vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin E. It's a wonderful fruit, carotenoids, at least in the vitamin A category. And we actually grow them. We have 12 varieties that grow here on our farm in Maui. Avocados are great food, and potassium is found in foods. You need to limit the potassium to the amount that's safe for your husband, and your doctor should be able to give you guidelines for that.
Early in the talk, you mentioned something about the liver, and how can you tell, are there some blood markers you can look at that tell you that your liver is getting into the diabetes danger zone?
Now, there's another thing that happens at night. Your blood sugar goes down. You haven't eaten in a long time. So another hormone is made, a peptide hormone called glucagon. This is made in the alpha cells in the pancreas, in the islets of Langerhans. So these alpha cells make this glucagon, which goes to the liver and tells the liver, start making more glucose. The brain is starving for glucose. So the primary fuel for the brain is glucose, nothing else. People who talk about acetone and other ketones as a fuel for the brain are not paying attention to physiology. The glucose is necessary. So your liver is making glucose all night long, or you wouldn't wake up. So the liver's really in charge of blood sugar to a large extent by either making or not making glucose. And it's crucial because when they're testing fasting glucose, you're usually asking you to fast for 12 to 14 hours overnight. And so it's not dietary glucose that's still stuck in your bloodstream. Typically, it's the amount of glucose that's still over manufactured by your liver because of the saturated fat overdose you had the day before.
Aren't nuts full of saturated fat?
Well, one nut is coconuts. You're absolutely right on that one. That is loaded with them. However, they do vary somewhat. Almonds, there's not much in the way of saturated fats in almonds, especially if you're eating, a handful of almonds, not a problem. Yes, there are a little bit though. So if you're eating, say, a handful of nuts, maybe mixed nuts, cashews, almonds, mac nuts, Brazil nuts, you're going to get some saturated fat from that handful, perhaps 1 or 2 grams out of your 11 or 12 that you get per day comes from those nuts. But they're accompanied by vitamin E, crucial. Did you know 93% of Americans don't even get the bare minimum of vitamin E? And that's because they don't eat nuts and seeds. So seeds, of course, have less saturated fat and plenty of vitamin E. Sesame seeds, sunflower seeds are extremely high in alpha tocopherol. So eating seeds might be even better because they have less saturated fat and more vitamin E in general. They vary. Sesame seeds are super high in calcium, for instance, another thing that we all need lots of. So nuts and seeds, I would consider powerhouses of nutrients with a little saturated fat. Compare with meat, which has a ton of saturated fat, but no antioxidants whatsoever, no vitamin E whatsoever, no fiber whatsoever, and none of so many other things, although it does have lots of persistent organic pollutants.
Joanna, do you have another question?
Yes, I do. My doctor is really wanting me to do omega-3 supplements. And I'm wondering if an omega-3 or DHA supplement that's made from really small fish, or like sardines, mackerel, and squid, is better than other fish oils. And also if you have a non-fish source of omegas that you would recommend.
Okay, great question. Omega-3s, of course, can be sourced from the plant source alpha linolenic acid. Alpha linolenic acid is then transformed in our bodies through an enzyme and made into stearidonic acid and then elongated into EPA and DHA, which are commonly known as fish oils. Humans make EPA and DHA in our bodies, and in my textbook, Fats and Oils Demystified, I have a whole chapter on how we make EPA and DHA from the basic ones. Now, some people don't make enough. Some doctors recommend the EPA and DHA. So the fish oils are very highly contaminated, mercury and PCBs and so on. However, you can get algal-based EPA and DHA. It's made from algae instead of fish. You get a lot less of the pollutants. Unfortunately, both fish oil and algal DHA and EPA are likely to be rancid. And rancid oils do increase DNA adducts, which can increase cancer risk. So what do? I put a tablespoon or 2 of ground up flax seeds on my oatmeal or salads or other things during the day. And that gives me plenty of omega-3s, which my body then turns into the long chain eicosapentaenoic acid and docosahexaenoic acid, EPA and DHA, fish oils made. And they tested the fish oil before it was even packaged. 91% was fully rancid.
What kind of oil would you use for sauteing vegetables?
Well, my wife's really the expert on that with her cookbooks. She tends not to use oil to saute vegetables. Isn't that amazing? So if you take a walk, and this is her talking now, you put perhaps a tablespoon of water in the bottom and put the vegetables in and put the top on, and under low heat, first of all, they start sweating a little bit of water so they don't burn, and stir them up. And then as they heat up a little bit, you can take the top off and stir them. Now, she will occasionally use a tiny bit of oil. Sesame seed oil is one of the best, and extra virgin olive oil is also acceptable. I like the sesame seed oil for cooking because it contains sesamin, a heat-activated antioxidant. And somehow the Japanese seem to know about this for centuries.
Is the sesame seed oil heavily processed?
Well, all oil is heavily processed, Susan, because all oil is ground up and squeezed. Now, if you get organic sesame seed oil, they might not add hexane to it, or carbon tetrachloride, or gasoline as a solvent to extract it. In my book, Fats and Oils Demystified, I do talk about the extraction of oils. And if you read that chapter, you never touch a bottle of oil again. Basically, they're taking all the good stuff out. I mean, you start with a sunflower and you make sunflower oil out of it. You've taken so much of the vitamin E, the fiber, all of the good things in there. And what have you turned it into? Empty calories.
What's your opinion on avocado oil?
Well, I think it's a pretty good oil, but you have to watch out for smoke point and, making it rancid as you cook it. So for a salad, I would much prefer the avocados. For cooking, I worry about the heat making it rancid. It's pretty fragile. Spirulina can be a problem, as well as chlorella and other greens, because of the BMAA, beta-methyl L-aminoalanine. This is closely related to amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, known as Lou Gehrig's disease. Also seems to be tightly coupled with Alzheimer's disease risk.
Now, I've got a question here. I suspect the answer is going to be the same as your answer for butter, but somebody wants to know, what about ghee?
Ghee. Yeah, I looked at ghee. Typically, ghee is clarified butter. And ghee is extremely high in cholesterol, in saturated fat. It could hardly be higher. So there's nothing in there but fat. Okay, it's almost pure fat, which is not a good thing. And then there's no antioxidants or other good things left. And it's rancid because it's been cooked at high heat. And then you have all the cholesterol and saturated fat. What's not to like?
Okay, what about soy milk?
Well, I do prefer organic soy milk because so much of the soy is grown genetically modified and heavily sprayed. So if you're going to drink soy milk, a lot of studies, Susan, on soy milk showing benefits, for instance, reducing breast cancer risk, and after breast cancer surgery, reducing risk of a reoccurrence. Great studies on reducing risk of prostate cancer. And this is generally because of the genistein and diastein and how they affect the receptors for hormonal cancers. They seem to be very, very helpful. And I have not dozens, but hundreds of studies on this, all agreeing and none contradicting.
There's a question about coconut milk. I assume, because there's a real thick coconut milk, and I assume the answer is going to be the same as coconut. And then the coconut milk you buy in the store is heavily diluted. So what's your opinion on coconut milk? I can guess.
Well, just take a look at the side of the can, Susan, and you'll see that typically a can of coconut milk has 55, my wife's coaching me here, 55 grams of saturated fat. So your daily limit is 12, under 12, and it has 55. If you do the math, you might need a calculator on this. It has 55 and you should have under 12. Gee, let me think. Way too much saturated fat. Okay, that's the downside. Way too much fat and calories, that's the downside. What about the good side? What about all the vitamin E in coconut milk? Oh, darn, there isn't any. There's only 2 nuts that don't have vitamin E, coconuts and mac nuts. What about the phytosterols that fight heart disease? Oh, sorry, it's one of the lowest ones there are. There's nothing in that can of coconut milk except creaminess that anyone would want. So I'd suggest different creaminess, such as cashew cream. Why not use a nut butter, a nut milk, or even a soy milk or an almond milk instead of the coconut milk, which is so high in saturated fat?
Yeah, I just learned about plant-based diet, a possibility to reverse diabetes. I didn't even know it was possible like a month ago. So I'm just learning it and so trying to move that way. But yes.
Yes, it's wonderful because it is actually possible in most cases. And you're recently diagnosed, so your beta cells are probably still in pretty good shape. So if you can revive those by getting your saturated fat down, and you mentioned carbs, but let's not say carbs, let's say fast releasing carbs or slow releasing carbs, and stick with the slow ones and try and avoid those fast ones. And if you have to do fast releasing carbs, then do what I do and eat a tiny amount.
We have a question here about how do we get enough protein if we're not eating meat?
Oh, that's a good one, Susan. Okay, I've been analyzing diets now for, almost 40 years. And you know how many diets I found that were low in protein? Out of thousands and thousands of diets, go ahead, guess. 3. 3. And those 3 ladies were all eating half the calories they needed to stay alive. They all 3 had some reason for not eating hardly any calories. They're all under 80 pounds. Poor things were starving to death. Anyone else with low protein? No. I've analyzed fruitarians, vegetarians, vegans, meat eaters, football players. Everybody gets enough protein. I'm on a completely plant-based diet. Okay, I don't eat any animal products at all. I get an average of 73 grams a day. How much do I need? 46. Okay, I get too much protein every day. When I work with people with Parkinson's disease, the most crucial element is to get their protein down to 40 or 50 grams per day, but nobody can do it. You can't do it. Okay, a plate of spaghetti, 2 cups of spaghetti with nothing on it, 21 grams of protein. Everybody over 50 needs 46, okay? So already you get half your protein from a plate of spaghetti with nothing on it. You throw on a couple of meatballs and you're already over the top for protein for the day. Did you know that grains had so much protein? Nuts have protein. Even vegetables have a little. Fruits have very little. But when you're looking at a normal diet by a real person, you cannot find low protein, and you can't find low protein quality either. The quality of protein is determined by the spectrum of amino acids. Do they get enough lysine? Do they get enough of all of the 8, for adults, essential amino acids? And yes, they do. And I actually have that graph in my nutritional analysis program. And you know what, Susan? I quit looking at it because I have never seen a real diet with anyone with poor protein quality ever. So no one gets too little protein. There is no reason to eat meat. And if you get too much protein, there are downsides to it. It leaches calcium out of your body. Did you know that? The calcium is leached from your bones and your teeth when you eat too much protein, especially animal protein, because the high sulfuric acid acidifies your blood. The calcium is a buffer, and your body needs to pull calcium out to do that. And this is explained in my textbook on vitamins and minerals in the calcium section. There's actually formulas for that. Sodium also pulls it out. And of course, a lot of meat products are very heavy in sodium as well. So I want to thank you, Susan, for staying up late. It's wonderful to see you again. I hope you're thriving in London.
And thank you so much, because you're so full of information. Diabetes is a huge medical issue in this country, and it leads to so many other illnesses. So it's so important. So I really appreciate all the information you shared with us today. So thank you so much.
You're certainly welcome. Thank you. Aloha
Okay.
from Maui.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you much.
now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.